On a dark and stormy night, a group of friends decided to explore the infamous Bachelor's Grove Cemetery, located just outside of Chicago. The place was already known for its macabre legends and supernatural sightings, but they were in search of something more, the true thrill of the unknown. Armed with flashlights and cameras, they walked through the rusty gate that creaked open as the cemetery itself warned them to stay away. As they made their way through the grounds, a sense of unease and oppression began to grow. The wind howled through the trees, creating eerie whispers that sounded like incomprehensible words. The air was heavy, and the smell of damp earth mingled with something else, something rotten and ancient. They had heard of the infamous cemetery bride, but none of them were prepared for what they were about to find. Near the center of the cemetery, one of the friends shouted, pointing with his flashlight shaking. There, amidst the moss-covered tombstones, stood a pale, ghostly figure. A woman dressed in an old wedding dress stood as if waiting for something or someone. Her face was pale as death, with empty eyes that seemed to stare straight into the soul of whoever looked at her. They stood paralyzed with fear, unable to move or look away. The bride began to move, gliding silently across the ground, making no sound except for the rustle of her dress against the wet grass. Her slow, measured steps were accompanied by a low wail, a sound of pain and despair that seemed to echo in their hearts. One of the friends, trying to gather courage, asked aloud, "Who are you? What do you want?" The bride stopped abruptly, and for the first time, they saw her lips move. Her words were an icy whisper that seemed to echo in everyone's mind. "I'm waiting, waiting for him." The terror reached its peak when the bride raised her hand, revealing a bouquet of wilted flowers, crumbling to dust at the touch. In an instant, she disappeared, leaving only the sound of an agonized scream that seemed to come from every direction. The panicked group ran back to the entrance of the cemetery, but the path seemed to stretch on forever, as if the place itself was playing tricks on their minds. Finally, when they reached the exit, they looked back and saw the figure of the bride in the distance, waving a somber goodbye. They knew then that the legend was true, that the bride of Bachelor's Grove Cemetery was trapped in an eternal cycle of waiting and despair, searching for the groom who never arrived. The friends were never the same after that night. They all reported recurring nightmares, where the bride visited them, asking for help, crying out for release from her eternal vigil. The weeks turned into months, but the terror of that night in Bachelor's Grove Cemetery continued to haunt the friends. Their once normal lives were now haunted by unexplained sights and sounds. The fear they had experienced in the cemetery now seeped into every aspect of their existence. Sam, one of the bravest of the group, began to see the bride everywhere. At first, it was just a glimpse in the mirror or a shadow in the distance. But as time passed, she began to appear closer, more real. On one particularly terrifying night, he woke to the freezing cold in his room and saw the spectral figure of the bride at the foot of his bed, whispering desperately, "Help me, find him." Desperate and unsure of what to do, Sam gathered the group to discuss what was happening. They met at Jenny's apartment, the only one who seemed unaffected by the events. As they recounted their experiences, one thing became clear. The bride was trying to communicate something they needed to discover in order to free her. They decided to return to the cemetery, despite the overwhelming fear they felt. Armed with recording equipment and blessed candles, they hoped to find answers. When they arrived there, the place seemed even more dark and oppressive than before. The full moon illuminated the tombstones, casting long, ominous shadows. Walking slowly through the cemetery, they began to ask questions aloud, asking the bride to reveal herself, and explain what she wanted. Suddenly, a cold breeze enveloped them, and the air became heavy with the scent of wilted flowers. The bride's figure appeared again, clearer and more distinct than before, with ghostly tears streaming down her face. The bride told her story. Her name was Eleanor, and she had been buried alive on her wedding day, the victim of a terrible accident and the misunderstanding that she was dead. Her fiancé, in despair, took his own life shortly after, and their spirits never met. Eleanor was trapped, waiting eternally for a reunion that would never happen. With this revelation, after the spirit uniting ceremony, the friends' lives returned to normal, but what they had experienced left a deep mark on each of them. Sam, Jenny, Alex, and Emma carried the emotional scars of that night, but also the relief of knowing that they had helped a lost soul find peace. Months later, Sam, now more introspective, decided that he wanted to learn more about Eleanor and her fiancé's past. He began visiting libraries and historical archives, delving into old Chicago records. He discovered that Eleanor and her fiancé, Thomas, were young lovers who had faced countless adversities to be together. The cruel fate that separated them was widely discussed at the time, and many believed that their souls were cursed. With this new information, Sam felt that there was more to do. He gathered his friends together again and shared what he had learned. They felt that even after the spirits were released, a proper memorial should be made to ensure that Eleanor and Thomas would be remembered for the love story that united them, and not just for the tragedies that haunted them. They decided to hold a small ceremony at Bachelor's Grove Cemetery, inviting only a few locals and historians. They built a small memorial in honor of the couple, inscribing their names and their love story on a bronze plaque. The ceremony was simple, but emotionally charged. Candles were lit around the memorial, and fresh flowers were placed as a symbol of renewal and peace. As the candles burned and the stars began to shine in the sky, a soft, comforting wind swept through the grounds. The friends felt a warm presence and knew in that moment that Eleanor and Thomas were together, finally at peace. After the ceremony, the local community began to see Bachelor's Grove Cemetery with new eyes. The place, once feared for its dark legends, was now visited by those who wanted to pay tribute to a love story that transcended death. The friends moved on with their lives, but the experience brought them together in an unbreakable way. They knew that together they had made a difference, and that realization gave them a sense of purpose and gratitude. Sam, in particular, found a new path as a local historian, dedicating his life to giving voice to forgotten souls. Years later, as the friends gathered to celebrate Eleanor and Thomas's memory, they realized how much they had grown and changed since that fateful night. And so the horror story that began on a dark night in Bachelor's Grove Cemetery turned into a story of love, redemption, and eternal friendship. Savannah, Georgia is a city known for its dark history and old world charm. Among the most mysterious places is Bonaventure Cemetery, a place as beautiful as it is haunted. With its avenues of oak trees covered in Spanish moss and ancient monuments, the cemetery has been the scene of countless supernatural sightings over the years. But no story is as disturbing as that of the Lady in White. It was an autumn night, and a group of young people had decided to explore the cemetery after hearing stories about its hauntings. They arrived at the main gate just before midnight, the time when legends said the spirits became most active. With flashlights in hand and hearts racing, they crossed the threshold of the cemetery, immediately feeling the cold and heavy air, as if the place itself were alive and watching them. As they walked along the winding paths, darkness seemed to close in around them. The sound of dry leaves beneath their feet echoed like bones cracking, and the wind whispered through the trees, carrying voices from a distant past. They reached a point where the tombstones were older and weathered. It was there that they saw, in the distance, a solitary figure. The lady in white stood motionless beside an ancient tombstone. Her dress, an ethereal white, shone in the dim moonlight, and her long black hair cascaded over her shoulders. Her eyes, dark and empty, seemed to stare at a distant point beyond the understanding of the living. With a mixture of fear and curiosity, the young people decided to approach. With each step, the temperature around them seemed to drop even further, and a feeling of deep sadness enveloped them. When they were only a few meters away from the figure, she slowly turned around, revealing a pale and tragic face. Without warning, the lady in white began to float toward them, her feet not touching the ground. One of the young men, Mark, felt an icy hand on his shoulder and heard a whisper that seemed to come from all around him. "Help me, please help me." In a panic, he tried to run, but his feet seemed rooted to the spot. The spectral figure was now just inches away from him, its empty eyes reflecting unimaginable despair. Suddenly, the young men's flashlights went out, plunging them into total darkness. Footsteps echoed all around them, although there was no one there. A low, anguished cry filled the air, and they could sense an evil presence watching them from the shadows. In the throes of terror, the lady in white raised a skeletal hand and pointed to a specific tombstone. Mark, shaking with fear, summoned the courage to look at the tombstone. The words engraved were barely legible, but he could make out the name Margaret and the date of death, which dated back to the 19th century. Suddenly, a vivid vision invaded his mind. Margaret, a young woman who had lost her son in a tragic accident and, consumed by grief, took her own life. Ever since then, her spirit had wandered the cemetery, searching for her lost son. Understanding the source of Margaret's torment, Mark and his friends decided they needed to help. They returned to the cemetery the next day, armed with flowers and candles, and held a small ceremony in honor of Margaret and her son. They prayed for their peace and laid the flowers on the ancient tombstone. That evening, as they watched the candles burn, a soft, warm breeze enveloped them. The figure of the lady in white appeared one last time, this time with an expression of gratitude and serenity. Slowly she disappeared, leaving a sense of relief and peace in the air. The young people, though still scarred by the terror of that night, felt they had done the right thing. Bonaventure Cemetery, though still mysterious, seemed less oppressive, as if a great weight had been lifted. The lady in white had finally found peace, and her desperate screams would no longer echo through the dark avenues of the cemetery. In the heart of New Orleans, among the tombs of one of the city's oldest and most enigmatic cemeteries, the St. Louis Cemetery, lies one of the most mysterious and feared figures in local folklore, Marie Laveau, the Voodoo Queen. The cemetery is known for its ornate tombs and haunted legends, but the presence of Marie Laveau gives the place a particularly unsettling aura. It was a muggy summer night when a group of friends decided to explore the cemetery, drawn by its reputation for supernatural phenomena. They arrived just before midnight, with the full moon illuminating the landscape with a pale, eerie light. The air was saturated with the scent of greenery and the distant sounds of New Orleans nighttime festivals. However, the atmosphere in the cemetery was different. It seemed charged with a palpable, oppressive energy. With flashlights and cameras in hand, the group made their way along the winding paths between the tombs. The sound of their voices and laughter echoed unsettlingly, creating a sense of disconnection from the outside world. As they approached the area where Marie Laveau's grave was located, the air seemed to grow even heavier and more charged, with an invisible tension. When they reached Marie Laveau's grave, the group was immediately struck by a freezing cold sensation. The headstone, covered in used candles and prayer marks, was surrounded by a circle of bottles and shells, as if it were still used in rituals. Some visitors left gifts and requests, believing that the Voodoo Queen still had the power to influence their lives. Suddenly, a cold breeze blew through the cemetery, extinguishing the lanterns and plunging them into total darkness. The group panicked, but before they could recover, they heard an unmistakable whisper that seemed to come from all around them. The words, in a low, guttural tone, said, "Have you come looking for me?" Everyone's heartbeat quickened. With their flashlights reappearing intermittently, they began to see a female figure materialize before them. It was Marie Laveau, with a turban wrapped around her head and an old-fashioned dress. Her presence was imposing, her eyes shining with an otherworldly intensity. She was there, not as a distant legend, but as a real, palpable presence. One of the friends, Sarah, tried to approach, but was stopped by a high-pitched, terrifying scream. The voodoo lady seemed to be in pain. With each step they took, the shadows around them seemed to lengthen and twist, creating menacing figures that danced at the edges of their vision. The group was surrounded by a growing sense of oppression, as if something was about to happen. The figure of Marie Laveau began to move slowly toward a secluded part of the cemetery. The group, although terrified, followed her, intrigued and terrified. The feeling that they were being guided by something beyond human comprehension was overwhelming. Finally, they came to an area where an old grave had been partially dug up. The earth was disturbed and the wooden planks of the coffin were broken, as if someone had tried to open the tomb. Marie Laveau turned to them, her expression a mixture of fury and sadness. "My rest has been interrupted," she whispered in a voice that seemed to come from a place far away. "My peace has been taken away by those who did not understand the power I possessed." She went on to explain that after her death, her spirit had been tormented by those who had tried to use her powers for evil purposes. Her grave had been desecrated and her rest disturbed, creating a chain of events that kept her in a state of eternal torment. Her spirit was trapped, unable to find peace as long as her grave remained desecrated. As the group listened in silence, Marie revealed that in order to free her, it was necessary to restore the integrity of her grave and perform a ritual of reparation. They were to return the earth to the grave, restore the grave to its original condition, and recite prayers of release. With trembling fear and determination, the group set to work. They gathered the earth, restored the coffin, and replaced the boards. As they worked, Marie's presence seemed to weaken, as if she was slowly being released from her suffering. As the ritual progressed, the atmosphere began to change. The air became lighter, and the feeling of oppression was replaced by a growing calm. Finally, when the ritual was complete and the tomb was restored, Marie Laveau appeared one last time, but this time with an expression of relief and gratitude. "Thank you," she murmured before disappearing into the darkness. Her presence was felt for the last time as a soft, warm breeze caressing the skin of her friends. As they left the cemetery, the group felt an immense weight lifted from their hearts. Although still scarred by the terror of that night, they knew they had done something important and meaningful. The St. Louis Cemetery, although still shrouded in mystery and legend, now seemed a little more serene. The group never had the courage to return to the cemetery again, but the experience brought them together in a profound way. They understood that the true essence of spirits is often linked to respect and reconciliation with the past. And so, the story of Marie Laveau and the St. Louis Cemetery remained a living and unforgettable part of their lives, reminding them of the power of legends and the importance of honoring those who came before us. The friends, traumatized by the experience, made a pact to never return to the St. Louis Cemetery at night. However, the scars of that night did not disappear. Sarah began to have recurring dreams of Marie Laveau, in which the spectral figure guided her through ancient rituals, showing her forgotten secrets of voodoo. Mark, in turn, began to feel a constant presence, as if he were being watched by something invisible. The other friends, Jenna and Tom, were also affected. Jenna, who had always been skeptical of the supernatural, began to have anxiety and panic attacks, especially when passing through dark or historical places. Tom, who was the most rational of the group, immersed himself in research into the life and practices of Marie Laveau in an attempt to understand what they had experienced. A few weeks after the fateful night, Sarah received an unexpected visit from an elderly woman who introduced herself as Madame Elise, a well-known voodoo practitioner in the area. Elise explained that she had felt a disturbance in the spirit world and that she knew Sarah and her friends were involved. She invited them to her small shrine to help them understand and deal with the aftermath of their encounter. Reluctant but desperate for answers, the friends accepted the invitation. Madame Elise's shrine was a warm and mysterious place filled with candles, herbs, and ancient symbols. Elise explained that Marie Laveau was not only a historical figure, but also a powerful spiritual guardian of New Orleans. Her presence in the cemetery was a sign that something had been disturbed. Elise performed a purification ritual for the friends, using sacred herbs and ancient chants. During the ritual, each of them experienced disturbing but also comforting visions. They saw Marie Laveau at different stages of her life, not only as a priestess, but also as an ordinary woman who served her community with love and compassion. Evergreen Cemetery, located in a small, sleepy village in the middle of the United States, is known for its tales of hauntings and unexplained events. The cemetery, with its ancient headstones and moss-covered graves, has always had a dark aura, but one story in particular has terrified locals for generations: the mysterious disappearance of a group of young people one fateful night. It was an autumn evening, with the sky covered in clouds and a thick fog creeping across the countryside. A group of 5 friends, Laura, Mike, Jess, Ryan, and Clara, decided to defy their fears and explore Evergreen Cemetery after hearing about a series of strange events that had occurred over the past few weeks. Their decision to go to the cemetery was driven by a mixture of curiosity and a desire to prove that the legends were just stories. They arrived at the cemetery at midnight, armed with flashlights and cameras, eager to document any evidence of the supernatural. The atmosphere was thick with a sense of desolation and unease. The fog seemed to engulf everything around them, and the silence was broken only by the sound of their voices and the crunch of dry leaves beneath their feet. As they explored, a growing sense of unease began to overcome the group. Their flashlights flickered on and off intermittently, casting ominous shadows on the tombstones. The surrounding trees seemed to move erratically, as if they were alive and watching them. The group reached a section of the cemetery that seemed older and more deteriorated. The tombstones were covered in moss, and the inscriptions were barely legible. In the center of this area was a ruined mausoleum with rusty iron doors and visible cracks in the walls. A sense of dread intensified when Mike, trying to be brave, decided to open one of the mausoleum's doors. As they pushed open the door, a loud crash echoed through the cemetery, followed by a freezing wind that made the lanterns go out completely. The darkness was abrupt and total. The group, now in a panic, tried to turn on the lanterns again, but they refused to work. A sense of foreboding enveloped them, and a low, incomprehensible murmur seemed to come from all sides. Laura, trying to remain calm, suggested that they leave, but before they could move, a figure appeared between the tombstones. It was a tall man, dressed in old clothes and covered in dirt. His face was partially covered by a wide-brimmed hat, and his eyes glowed with an unearthly hue. He seemed to be crawling, as if emerging from a tomb. The man approached slowly, and the group was overcome by absolute terror. Their screams were muffled by the fog, and a general panic took hold of them. The man's figure seemed to multiply, with other apparitions emerging from the shadows and surrounding them. Every time they looked into the shadows, it seemed as if something was watching them back, and eerie sounds of whispering and wailing filled the air. Ryan tried to call the police with his phone, but the signal was completely lost. Communication was cut off, and any attempt to contact the outside world seemed futile. Clara, desperate, began running in circles, banging on tombstones and trying to open the cemetery gates, but they were locked in an inexplicable way. The group was now scattered and desperate. Jess and Laura found refuge behind a large tombstone, while Mike and Ryan tried to calm Clara. However, the feeling of desperation and of being watched by something invisible was overwhelming. The mysterious man seemed to be getting closer and closer, and a black shadow, like a thick fog, enveloped the place. As the night wore on, the friends began to notice that the cemetery was changing. The familiar paths turned into endless mazes, and the tombstones seemed to move, creating a jumble of shapes and directions. The feeling that they were being hunted grew stronger with each passing moment. Desperately, they gathered near the mausoleum, where Mike, exhausted and terrified, made one last attempt to escape. With desperate strength, he managed to open the mausoleum door and, to his surprise, found an ancient stone altar. On top of the altar was a worn leather book and old candles, as if someone had been performing a ritual long ago. Laura, trying to calm the situation, suggested that the group perform a protection ritual, following the instructions in the book. With trembling hands and tears in their eyes, they lit the candles and recited the words they could understand. The atmosphere began to change, and a faint light began to emerge from the candles. As the light spread, the fog and shadows began to recede. The ominous presence seemed to dissipate, and the sense of dread was replaced by an eerie calm. The group, still shaking, managed to find their way back to the cemetery gate. When they emerged, the sun was rising, and the cemetery finally seemed peaceful. The friends, though relieved, were deeply traumatized. They reported their experiences to the police and the media, but most people found their story hard to believe. Evergreen Cemetery remained a feared and avoided place, especially at night. Laura, Mike, Jess, Ryan and Clara never returned to the cemetery. Each of them dealt with the trauma in their own way, but the experience bonded them forever. They learned the hard way that some places are better left alone, and that there are forces in the world that are beyond human comprehension. Evergreen Cemetery, with its shadows and mysteries, remained a place of awe and reverence, a grim reminder that the unknown can often be more terrifying than any story that can be told. And as time passed, the cemetery remained a scene of legend and mystery, with tales of terror continuing to fuel the fear and fascination of those who dared approach its gates. At the end of the ritual, Elise explained that Marie Laveau had forgiven her friends, but that they needed to do one last thing to restore balance. They needed to return to the cemetery during the day and make a proper offering at Marie Laveau's grave, asking for her protection and blessing. And the next day, the friends, although still nervous, returned to St. Louis Cemetery. They took with them flowers, candles, and sacred herbs that Madame Elise had given them. When they arrived at the grave, they felt an unexpected calm, as if they were welcomed. They arranged the offering carefully and, in unison, asked for Marie Laveau's protection and blessing. As they finished the ritual, a gentle breeze enveloped them, and a sense of peace filled them. Marie Laveau's figure did not appear, but they felt her presence in a comforting way. They knew in that moment that she had accepted their prayers. As they left the cemetery, the friends felt a weight lifted. The visions and nightmares ceased, and each of them began to find a new balance in their lives. Sarah continued to have dreams about Marie Laveau, but now they were filled with wisdom and guidance, helping her grow spiritually. Mark found new purpose in studying and respecting spiritual practices, feeling connected to something greater. Jenna and Tom, though scarred by their experiences, also found ways to move forward. Jenna overcame her anxiety attacks to become a mental health advocate, while Tom dedicated himself to the history and culture of New Orleans, honoring the memory of Marie Laveau in his research. The story of the friends' encounter with the Voodoo Queen became a legend among New Orleanians, a reminder of the power and respect that the spirit world demands. And at St. Louis Cemetery, Marie Laveau's grave remained a place of reverence and mystery, where those who dared disturb her rest knew they had to show respect and seek redemption. Hollow Creek Cemetery, located on the outskirts of a small, forgotten town, is a place shrouded in mystery and terror. With its ancient, moss-covered tombstones and twisted trees standing as sinister sentinels, the cemetery is known for its inexplicable events and disturbing apparitions. The story you are about to read is about a visit that would turn into a nightmarish journey for a group of friends. It was a particularly cold winter night, with the wind howling through the fields and the full moon casting a spectral light over the landscape. The group, consisting of 4 friends, Elena, Jack, Sophie, and Lucas, decided to challenge their beliefs and explore Hollow Creek Cemetery after hearing rumors about an ancient vengeful spirit supposedly haunting the place. The decision to visit the cemetery was driven by a series of strange occurrences that had recently taken place in their town. Reports of apparitions and inexplicable phenomena had become frequent, and the group was determined to uncover the truth behind these stories. Armed with lanterns, cameras, and a willingness to face the unknown, they headed to the cemetery at midnight. Upon arrival, the atmosphere was charged with a sinister feeling. The wind seemed to whisper indecipherable words, and the moonlight cast grotesque shadows on the tombstones and graves. The group felt a chill run down their spines, but fueled by adrenaline. They pressed on toward the center of the cemetery. As they explored, they noticed that something was amiss. The lanterns began to fail, flickering erratically, and the silence was only broken by the distant ticking of a clock every hour. Sophie, who was closest to the group, began to sense an invisible presence, as if someone was watching her. The group decided to split up to cover more ground. Elena and Jack headed towards the old mausoleum located at the far end of the cemetery, while Sophie and Lucas stayed near a large, ancient tree that seemed to be the focal point of the reported paranormal activity. Upon reaching the mausoleum, Elena and Jack found the structure in a state of disrepair, with the rusted iron door nearly falling off its hinges. They entered cautiously, and the darkness was so thick that their lanterns could not penetrate it. The inside of the mausoleum was filled with dust and cobwebs, and there was an oppressive feeling in the air. In the center of the place was an altar, covered with old candles, and a weathered leather book. Meanwhile, Sophie and Lucas began to hear a peculiar sound coming from the tree, a low scratching, as if something was trying to emerge from within the trunk. Lucas, with a burst of courage, approached the tree to investigate, while Sophie watched with growing apprehension. Suddenly, the tree began to shake, and a dark, indistinct figure emerged from the roots, seemingly composed of a mix of shadows and mist. Back in the mausoleum, Elena and Jack, unaware of what was happening outside, examined the ancient book. The cover was engraved with esoteric symbols, and upon opening it, they found a series of rituals and formulas. Jack, curious, began reading one of the formulas aloud. At that moment, an invisible force seemed to manifest, and a chilling cold enveloped the mausoleum. The atmosphere grew heavier, and the candles began to light themselves, casting a sinister glow on the walls. Elena and Jack felt an increasing presence, as if the mausoleum itself was alive and pulsing with malevolent energy. Outside the mausoleum, the situation was equally disturbing. Sophie, terrified by the appearance of the dark figure, tried to pull Lucas away from the tree, but he was paralyzed with fear. The dark figure seemed to be trying to speak, but its voice was an incomprehensible whisper. Sophie managed to drag Lucas away from the tree, but the figure followed them, emitting a sound of anguished lament. The four friends, now in a panic, tried to regroup in the center of the cemetery. The lanterns failed once again, plunging them into total darkness. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and the murmurs and screams of terror echoed through the cemetery. They were completely disoriented, and the maze of tombstones and graves seemed to have turned into a cruel game of hide and seek. Finally, the sinister presence revealed itself in the form of a spectral entity, a pale and deformed figure, with empty eyes and a gaze full of rage. The spirit seemed to be searching for something, and the friends soon realized that it was linked to the book found by Elena and Jack. Desperate, they tried to follow the instructions in the book, hoping to reverse the situation. With the candles still burning, they performed an improvised ritual, attempting to calm the entity. The words they recited were partially incorrect, and the entity became even more enraged, unleashing a wave of negative energy that caused the cemetery to be engulfed in a nightmarish chaos. The group struggled to escape, and the entity seemed to feed on their fear and confusion. Every step they took seemed to lead to a new terror, and the apparitions became more intense and threatening. With a desperate effort, they managed to find their way back to the cemetery gate, which was inexplicably open. As they exited, the entity let out one final piercing scream that made the group tremble with fear. A feeling of relief mixed with deep terror overwhelmed them. as they finally escaped the cemetery. The sun was rising, and the cemetery seemed to have returned to its superficial calm. But the four friends knew that something had changed forever. Elena, Jack, Sophie, and Lucas were never the same again. The experience deeply scarred them, and each of them dealt with the trauma in different ways. Elena and Jack, traumatized by what they found in the mausoleum, turned to studying the occult and paranormal phenomena, while Sophie and Lucas, terrified by the dark figure, sought help to overcome their fears. The story of what happened at Hollow Creek Cemetery became a local legend, a grim warning about the dangers of meddling with forces beyond comprehension. The cemetery continued to be avoided and feared, and the weathered leather book was kept in a safe place away from curious hands. Hollow Creek Cemetery remains a place of mystery and terror, a somber reminder that there are forces in the world that defy our understanding, and that some stories are best left untold. The cemetery, with its dark secrets, continues to be a setting where fear and fascination intersect, and where the legends of terror are kept alive by those who dare to approach its gates.